Hello, this is the fourth video in my series on the British anti-slavery movement, this one dealing with the period from 1793 until 1807, which began with setbacks and ended with success. When the French Revolution first broke out in the summer of 1789, it attracted much support amongst reform-minded Britons, including Thomas Clarkson, who spent several weeks in France, meeting and encouraging French abolitionists and observing events with approval. Public opinion in Britain shifted at the news of increasing violence in France, however, and with the outbreak of war in February 1793, the British government began to move against all signs of sedition, creating an atmosphere of repression in which reformist ideas of almost any kind became suspect. As leading advocates of change, the abolitionists lost the support of many of their former sympathizers in Parliament. The slave revolts which occurred in the Caribbean at this time, which I will discuss in another video, were also blamed on the abolitionists' propaganda, and conservative speakers linked the abolitionist cause to French Jacobinism. In this environment, Wilberforce continued to introduce bills against the slave trade for some years, but they were all rejected. Meanwhile, the abolitionist committees became inactive, and Clarkson was so exhausted by his previous efforts that he retired for a while to the Lake District. It was a bleak time for the abolitionists, and in the absence of French competition, the British slave trade flourished, even the British Army beginning to buy slaves to be inducted into its forces from 1795 onwards. At the same time, popular support for the abolitionist cause continued, even if not vocally. It received an impetus in 1796 with the publication of John-Steadman's best-selling book, The Narrative of a 5-Year Expedition Against the Revolted Negroes of Suriname. In it, Stedman presented an account of 5 years he had spent with Dutch forces in the 1770s, putting down rebellious escaped slaves. Although at one level a colourful and romantic adventure story, Stedman's respect for the Africans he was fighting against was readily apparent, as was his disgust at the horrific punishments which were often meted out upon the slaves. The book's impact was enhanced by the publisher's decision to commission illustrations by the well-known artist William Blake, two of which became some of the most powerful visual images of the horrors of slavery, one showing a male slave hung up alive by a meat hook through his ribs as a punishment, and the other of a half-naked slave woman tied up about to be whipped. This hiatus ended in the early 1800s, with a revival of determination and activities amongst the abolitionists, and a revival of national confidence following the definitive ending of the French naval threat with the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. The defeat of the French in Haiti by armies of ex-slaves in 1802, combined with the earlier experiences and staggering losses of British troops in Haiti and against slave rebels in other parts of the Caribbean, had also changed the public perception of slavery. The revival of abolitionist activity was linked to the work of James Stedman, an eminent trade lawyer whose former time in the Caribbean had given him a lifelong hatred of slavery. In 1802, Stedman published The Crisis of the Sugar Colonies, arguing realistically that maintaining the sugar colonies represented a major problem for Britain, recent events indicating the readiness of the slaves to rebel, and the enormous costs in lives and money to suppress such rebellions. Stedman was a keen patriot and was instrumental in tightening the British economic blockade of France in 1805 by encouraging the government to authorize the Royal Navy to intercept neutral ships to check on the legality of their cargoes and seize those regarded as contraband. He also brought to the abolitionist cause a useful degree of legal and political cunning. Thus he convinced Wilberforce that the abolitionists should try a different approach in 1806, by getting the government to ban any British subject from participating in trading slaves to the colonies of France or any of its allies. Seen as a patriotic means of supporting the war effort, the bill quickly passed and became law. But as the targets included the many British ships that were sailing under an American flag, so as to surreptitiously conduct normal trade in time of war, this effectively extended the neutral ships order of the previous year. It meant that the Royal Navy could intercept an American-flagged slave ship, a large number of which were actually British, and if it was found to be going to or coming from a French port, then the cargo of slaves or of sugar could be confiscated as contraband. It was a major blow to the economy of the British slave trade. Both the 1805 order and the 1806 law were popular in naval circles, as they both strengthened the powers of the Royal Navy and increased the opportunities for officers and men, and of British privateers, to gain prize money if they seized contrabanded goods, including slaves. The legislation was cleverly devised to split the two parts of the West India lobby. Only the slave traders would suffer, whilst the plantation owners would support the new law as it damaged their foreign competitors. This somewhat underhanded success emboldened the abolitionists to attack the slave trade directly again. The National Abolitionist Network was reanimated, and in elections held in 1806, abolitionism actually became an election issue in several constituencies. With substantial support in the Commons, and with the new pro-abolition Prime Minister, Lord Grenville, in the House of Lords, the Act was quickly passed, becoming law on the 1st of May, 1807. It had been 20 years since the establishment of the Abolitionist Society in London, but the greatest of the European slave-trading nations had now made the trade illegal, massively changing the Atlantic economy. Slavery continued in the British West Indies, but many abolitionists felt that now that the importation of new slaves was banned, slavery itself would gradually atrophy, and that in the meantime the slave owners would be forced to treat their slaves better, so as to diminish their high death rates. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy had started anti-slaving patrols off the West African coast and begun to seize slave ships. Although most of the rescued slaves were eventually landed in Sierra Leone, whilst the war with France continued, fit young males were liable to be immediately inducted into the Navy as seamen. With the end of the French wars, the government began to pressure other countries to end their participation in the slave trade. Naval searches and seizures also continued, and slave trading was treated increasingly severely, eventually being designated as equivalent to piracy, and as such, a capital offence.